It is late, and I have ended up here again, thinking about a kid from Queens who got bitten by a spider more than 60 years ago. That happens to me a lot at this hour. The day goes quiet, the phone stops asking for anything, and my mind wanders back to the same worn corner of Marvel, the one with the fire escapes and the water towers, and the boy who never quite gets to catch his breath. Of all the heroes they have made, he is the one I keep returning to when everything else has gone still. Maybe because he was built from the start to be tired, to be behind on his homework and short on rent, and late for the people who love him. There is something restful about a hero whose whole life is a series of near misses. You do not have to brace for him to win. You already know he mostly just keeps going. So that is what tonight is. This is Sleepy Marvel, and this is the kind of thing we do here. Long and slow and wandering. Lore for people who think about these universes at exactly the moment they should probably be asleep. I am going to walk you through Spider-Man, the whole shape of him, where he came from, who made him, the people around him, the villains who have chased him for decades, the stories that broke readers' hearts, and a whole layer of strange behind-the-scenes history that even a lot of longtime fans have never heard. None of this is a test. You do not need to have read a single comic. You do not need to remember anything from one sentence to the next. If you already feel yourself going under, that is not a problem. That is the whole idea. That is exactly where you are meant to be. A quick subscribe is welcome if this turns out to be your kind of thing. But there is truly no pressure tonight. Settle in, get comfortable, let your eyes close whenever they want to. Here is roughly where we are going, so you can stop keeping track and just drift. We will start at the very beginning, in a failing comic book in the summer of 1962, with the two difficult, brilliant men who dreamed him up and then stopped speaking to each other. From there, we will go to the bite itself, the spider and the dead uncle, and the famous line that almost nobody remembers correctly. Then the costume and the powers and how they actually work, which is stranger and more specific than the movies let on. Then his world, the aunt and the newspaper and the city. Then the villains, one at a time, taken seriously as people. Then the great sad stories, the ones fans still argue about at 2 in the morning. Then the marriage and the clones and the literal deal with the devil. And at the very end, the wider web, all the other people wearing the mask across all the other worlds. This is not a countdown. Nothing is building to a big reveal. There is no payoff I am saving for the end. We are just going to move through it slowly, together, and see how far we get before you are gone. So let us go back to the beginning, to the man who almost did not exist at all. In the summer of 1962, Spider-Man was very nearly nobody's idea of a good bet. He first appeared in a comic called Amazing Fantasy in the 15th issue, cover dated August of that year, and on the newsstands in the middle of the summer. What almost nobody outside the industry knew at the time was that this was a dying book. Amazing Fantasy was an anthology title, a grab bag of short science fiction and monster and twist-ending stories, and it had been selling badly enough that Marvel, which was then a small operation called Atlas, going by another name, had already decided to cancel it. Issue 15 was the last one. Spider-Man made his entrance in the final issue of a series that was already being put out of its misery. He was, in the coldest business sense, a thing you try when you have nothing left to lose. The reason he got in the door at all is one of my favorite pieces of comics history, because it is so ordinary and so human. The publisher, a man named Martin Goodman, did not want Spider-Man. Stan Lee, who was then the editor and the main writer of the whole line, and a man desperate to make comics that felt a little more grown up, brought Goodman the pitch. And Goodman, by Lee's own retelling for the rest of his life, gave him 3 reasons it would never work. First, people hate spiders, so you cannot build a hero around one. Nobody will want to look at him. Second, teenagers in comics are sidekicks. They are the kid who follows the real hero around. They are not the star. And third, a hero should not have personal problems, because readers want to escape their problems, not read about somebody else's. Those were the 3 walls Goodman put up. And if you know anything at all about Spider-Man, you already know that those 3 objections are, almost word for word, the exact 3 things that made him work. A hero named after a creature people flinch at. A teenager as the lead, not the helper. And a life absolutely overflowing with personal problems, money and girls and homework and guilt. Goodman handed Lee the blueprint by listing everything he thought was wrong with it. The only reason Goodman said yes anyway is that the book was already canceled. He figured there was no risk. Put the weird spider kid in the last issue of a title nobody was buying, let it die quietly, and move on. And then the sales figures came back. Amazing Fantasy 15 turned out to be one of the best-selling comics Marvel put out that whole year, and Goodman, who had been so sure teenagers with problems would sink, came back to Lee and asked, in so many words, where the rest of it was. Give this spider kid his own book. The character survived on a technicality and then refused to leave. I want to sit with the two men who actually made him, because the story of Spider-Man's creation is also a quiet story about credit and how it curdles. The writer and editor was Stan Lee. The artist, and this matters enormously, was Steve Ditko. And there is a third name that usually gets left off, Jack Kirby, the other titan of that early Marvel, who drew the cover of that first issue. The published cover, the famous one, is Kirby's pencils inked by Ditko. But the interior, the actual look and feel and body language of Spider-Man, that is Ditko, and the character is unimaginable without him. The way the assignment landed is telling. Lee first gave the job to Kirby because Kirby was his powerhouse, the man who could draw anything and make it look like a god descending. And Kirby drew some sample pages, maybe half a dozen, and Lee looked at them and rejected them. The reason he gave was that Kirby had made Spider-Man too heroic. Kirby drew gods and titans by instinct. His Spider-Man came out looking like a strong, confident, square-jawed champion, and that was precisely wrong for a nervous science kid who gets picked on. So Lee took the pages away from the biggest name in the building and handed the character to Ditko, whose line was thinner, stranger, more anxious, more human, and that instinct was correct. Ditko's Spider-Man is all elbows and worry. He is a real teenager in a way Kirby's simply was not. Ditko then designed nearly everything we picture. The full-face mask was his idea, and his reasoning was practical and a little bit brilliant. If you cover the whole face, you hide the fact that Peter Parker is a soft-featured boy, which keeps the mystery, and it means anyone could be under there, which lets the reader project themselves into the suit. He gave the costume no boots, because the character sticks to walls and would want his feet free to do it. He designed the web pattern, the big teardrop eye lenses, all of it. And crucially, Ditko invented the web shooters as machines. In Ditko's version, and this stayed the comics version for decades, Peter does not produce webbing from his body. He is a science prodigy who invents a chemical web fluid in his aunt's house and builds little mechanical shooters that he wears on his wrists. Lee liked this because a machine can fail. The shooters can jam, the cartridges can run dry at the worst possible moment, and that vulnerability is baked into the character. The idea that Spider-Man produces webbing organically, from his own body, is not from the comics at all. That idea actually traces back to James Cameron's unproduced Spider-Man script from years earlier, and when Sam Raimi and his screenwriter shaped the 2002 film, they chose to keep it, and it works for the screen, but for the first 4 decades of this character, the web was a gadget that could betray him. There is a small, funny compromise buried in Ditko's design that I love. Lee wanted Spider-Man in the mask as much as possible, in costume on nearly every page, because that is the exciting part. Ditko wanted room for Peter Parker to just be a boy, out of the suit, dealing with his life. So Ditko started drawing Peter in these moments where you see half his ordinary face and half the mask. Mid-change, one identity peeled back to show the other underneath. It was a working artist's negotiation with his editor, a way to keep the hero present in the quiet scenes, and it accidentally became one of the defining images in the whole character's history, the two faces meeting on one head. Even the colors nearly went another way. Ditko, by his own later account, always intended Spider-Man to be orange and purple. The blue got swapped in partly by circumstance. The Fantastic Four do turn up as guests early in the ongoing series, but the red and blue we all know were already there from his very first appearance. in Amazing Fantasy number 15, and the shift away from the orange and purple Ditko had in his head came down to the cheap newsprint of the era, which rendered bold primary colors far more clearly than his original palette. It is strange to think that the color scheme everyone recognizes on sight in superhero comics is partly an accident of who else was standing on the page that day, and the name, and the little hyphen in it. Lee did not arrive at Spider-Man cleanly. By his telling, he ran through a whole insect drawer of options first. Flyman, Insect Man, Mosquito Man, none of them right. When he landed on the spider, he added the hyphen Spider-Man on purpose to keep it from reading too much like Superman at a glance across a crowded newsstand. And by some accounts, he leaned toward man over boy, even with a teenage hero under the mask, since it left the door open for Peter to grow older with the readers. Spider-Boy would have been trapped at a certain age forever. Spider-Man could get older. That one small decision, man instead of boy, is a big part of why this character has been able to graduate, and go to college, and get jobs, and marry and lose a marriage, and age in fits and starts across 60 years, while so many of his peers stayed frozen. There is a wonderful footnote about how sloppy the whole enterprise actually was under the surface, which is that Stan Lee could barely keep his own character's name straight. He admitted years later, to Kevin Smith of all people, that he gave so many heroes alliterative names: Peter Parker, Bruce Banner, Reed Richards, Matt Murdock, purely because his memory was bad, and if both names started with the same letter, he had a fighting chance of remembering at least one of them, and even that system failed him. There are fan accounts, not fully confirmed, that even Stan Lee himself once garbled the name in an early printing. The best-known secret identity in comics got its own author's memory wrong in print. Even the logo, that spiky wordmark, was not Ditko's. By some accounts from comics historians, the original cover logo may not have been Ditko's work at all, and the hyphen we know today might not have been part of that very first design. The hyphen and the redesign came in with the ongoing title, and there is supposedly a practical wrinkle behind the scenes, that the logo needed reworking soon after, for reasons tied to the comics code seal, though the details vary depending on who tells it. The mythology we treat as eternal was, at the drawing board, a bunch of working men solving small problems on deadline. Here is a piece of trivia that delighted me when I found it, and it is a good one to drift on. Aunt May and Uncle Ben, in a sense, existed before Spider-Man did. Some fans point to an earlier Lee and Ditko short story in another anthology featuring a kindly older couple with similar names, though how directly it connects to Peter's aunt and uncle is debated. It reads now like a dry run, the same warm, worried, working-class household that would become Peter's home, sketched out before the boy who would live in it. The family arrived before the hero. That is the sort of detail you only find if you go looking in the corners, and it makes the whole thing feel less like a single lightning strike, and more like an idea that had been forming slowly for a while. One more before we leave the beginning, because it is honestly funny. The magazine dropped a word from its own name to make room for him. Before that 15th issue, the book was called Amazing Adult Fantasy. Lee's little editorial boast on the title was that it was the magazine for grown-up readers. And by the account of the people involved, they cut the word adult off the masthead right around Spider-Man's arrival, in part because the teenage readers they actually wanted felt awkward buying something that announced itself as being for adults. So the book that launched the signature teenage hero in comics did it by first taking the word adult off its own cover. Small, human, a little absurd. That is the register this whole origin lives in, and I find it very calming. This idea that the thing we treat as monumental was, at the time, just a bunch of people trying to move copies of a dying magazine. Now, the two men who made him did not stay together long, and the way they came apart is its own quiet tragedy that I want to spend a moment on before the boy even gets his powers. Because for a while it worked beautifully. Ditko's role grew and grew. He was not just drawing the book, he was increasingly plotting it, working out the actual stories, with Lee scripting the dialogue over Ditko's plotted pages. And Lee, to his credit, at a certain point gave Ditko a formal plotting credit, which was rare and meaningful in that era when the writer-editor took most of the glory. There is a famous credit box from around the 25th and 26th issues where it lays it out almost sheepishly. Script by Stan Lee, plot and art by Steve Ditko, the language getting fancier and more elaborate, as if to paper over how unusual it was to admit the artist was steering the ship. But the two of them drifted into a silence that never healed. By the end they were, by multiple accounts, not speaking to each other at all, communicating through the production manager, and Ditko simply left. After the 38th issue of The Amazing Spider-Man, he walked out. He gave no grand speech. He told the production manager he was quitting, and that was more or less it. Lee later said he just showed up one day and announced he was leaving, and that Lee never fully understood why. Ditko, for his part, wrote decades afterward that Lee chose not to know or hear why he left. Two men made one of the great characters of the century together and then spent the rest of their lives on opposite sides of a wall neither would explain. There is a famous legend about why they split, that it was a fight over the Green Goblin, over who the villain would turn out to be, with Ditko supposedly wanting the man under the mask to be a nobody, a stranger off the street, and Lee wanting him to be someone we already knew. And it is a great story. Whether that particular version of events is accurate is hard to say, since even Ditko's own later comments on it were not entirely consistent. Some later interviews even have Ditko suggesting the Goblin's identity was not the real sticking point, though other tellings still place it near the center of the split. The real split was quieter and harder to dramatize, a matter of personality and politics and credit, and two stubborn men who had simply had enough of each other. Ditko was a devout follower of the philosopher Ayn Rand, a serious objectivist, probably the foremost one in all of comics, a man whose personal moral code was rigid to the point of absolutism, and that worldview colored how he thought a hero should behave. You can feel that pressure in the later Ditko issues, a hardening. When he left, Lee brought in John Romita Sr., and the book changed again, softer and more romantic and more soap operatic, and that is the version that became a runaway bestseller. But the strange, anxious, morally severe Spider-Man of those first 36 issues, that is Ditko's, and I think it is the truest version there is. And even the way Ditko went out has a telltale detail. His very last cover, on that 38th issue, was not a fresh drawing. By the account preserved on the Marvel Wiki, Ditko would not draw a new cover amid the breakdown with The Office, so the cover was cobbled together out of 4 panels lifted from the interior pages. The final image of his tenure on the character he co-created is a collage of leftovers, assembled because he would not sit down and make one more. There is something almost unbearably sad and completely human about that, and it is a good place to pause before we get to the part everyone knows, the spider and the bite. So here is the moment the whole thing turns on, and it is worth telling slowly because it is so much stranger and more specific than the version most people carry around. Peter Parker is a bright, lonely high school kid in Forest Hills, Queens. He lives with his elderly aunt and uncle, May and Ben, who took him in as a small child. He is the kind of student who loves science, who gets top marks and no invitations, who watches the popular kids the way you watch weather, from behind glass. And one afternoon he goes to a public science exhibition, a demonstration of radioactivity, and while he is standing there among the machinery, a common house spider drifts down into the path of the radiation, is bathed in it, and, dying, lands on Peter's hand and bites him. That is the accident. In the original 1962 story, it is that plain, a spider that happened to catch a fatal dose of radiation and passed something of it into the boy before it died. Peter goes home feeling strange and quickly discovers what has happened to him. He can stick to walls. He is suddenly impossibly strong, strong enough to bend a steel pipe without thinking. He is fast and agile, in a way his body never was before, and he has this new sense, a prickle at the back of the skull, that warns him a fraction of a second before something dangerous happens. The bite rewrote him from the inside. Now, the exact nature of that spider has been an open question for the entire life of the character, and it is a lovely thing to turn over at this hour, because there is no settled answer at all. Lee and Ditko never gave the spider a species. It was just a spider, irradiated by accident. Decades later, other writers and other media tried to fill the gap, and they filled it with completely different answers. One film gave the spider a made-up scientific name, a fictional genetically engineered species. A later comic identified it as a real species, a noble false widow. There is no single canon answer, because the men who created it never needed one. The most examined bite in the history of fiction is, at its root, deliberately vague, and every attempt to pin it down has just added another version to the pile. And then, in 2001, a writer named J. Michael Straczynski added a wrinkle that fans still argue about, and I want to be careful to frame this correctly because it is exactly the kind of thing that gets miscarried as settled fact when it is not. Straczynski introduced a character called Ezekiel and floated the idea that the spider was not really a random accident at all, that it was mystical, part of a much older web of spider totems, and that as it died it did not so much bite the nearest person as choose Peter, passing on a power it had been carrying. This is the totem reading. It reframes the whole origin as something fated rather than random, and it is beautiful as a piece of writing. But it was always presented as an overlay, a possible deeper truth laid over the top of the radioactive accident, rather than a formal replacement for it. The story itself keeps both alive. In one exchange, Peter tells his mystical stalker that the spider was irradiated, and the answer is essentially that the radiation is why a certain predator could not simply consume the power. So the science and the mysticism sit on top of each other. Later writers largely walked the totem idea back toward the classic version, so the honest way to hold it is this. The radioactive bite is the canon origin. The totem is a haunting later interpretation that the comics have flirted with and then quietly stepped away from. If someone tells you it is definitely one or the other, they are tidying up a thing that was left deliberately blurry. Here is the piece of this that reordered my whole sense of that famous scene, and it is one of the facts I most wanted to make sure I told you tonight. For more than 50 years, The Bite was a story about one boy, one spider, one victim, one destiny. And then, in 2014, a writer revealed that the same spider, in the same moment, bit a second person. A classmate of Peter's, a girl named Cindy Moon, was standing nearby, and the dying spider bit her too, seconds after it bit him. She got powers of her own, and for reasons the story explains, she spent years hidden away, which is why we never heard of her. But the thing that unsettles me in the best way is what it does to the origin. The best remembered accident in comics was never just Peter's accident. There was a second child in the room who walked away changed, and the myth simply forgot to mention her for half a century. Cindy Moon became the hero called Silk, and every time I picture that science demonstration now, I picture two kids feeling strange on the way home instead of one. But the powers are not the origin. This is the thing people who have not read the comics sometimes miss. Getting bitten by the spider is not what makes Peter Parker into Spider-Man. What makes him Spider-Man is what he does wrong immediately afterward and the price he pays for it. Because the first thing Peter does with his new abilities is exactly what a lot of us would do. He tries to cash in. He goes on television as a masked performer, a novelty act, and he is good at it, and he starts to taste a little money and a little fame. And one night at the studio, a thief runs past him, right past him, fleeing a security guard, and Peter, who could stop the man without effort, simply lets him go. It is not his problem. Nobody is paying him to be a hero. He lets the guy run into the elevator and out of his life, and he feels, if anything, a little smug about it, a little above it all. You already know what that costs, because the whole moral universe of this character is built on the bill coming due. A few days later, Peter comes home to find that his Uncle Ben, the gentle man who raised him, has been shot and killed by a burglar who broke into their house. Peter, in a fury, goes after the killer in costume, corners him, and only when he has the man helpless does he see his face, and it is the same thief, the same runner from the studio, the one he could have stopped and chose not to. The man he let walk out of that elevator is the man who murdered his uncle. There is no supervillain here, no grand plan, just a small crime that Peter could have prevented for free and did not, circling back to take the person he loved most. The guilt of that is the actual engine of the character, not the spider, the choice, and the corpse it led to. Which brings us to the most famous sentence in superhero comics, and to the fact that almost everyone remembers it wrong, and this is another one I really wanted to get right for you. The line is, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." In the movies, and in the collective memory, that line belongs to Uncle Ben. It is the wise thing the doomed father figure says to the boy, the moral he hands down before he dies, so that it echoes for the rest of Peter's life. Except that is not how it happened in 1962. In the original Amazing Fantasy story, Uncle Ben never says it. Ben does not deliver a speech. The line is not dialogue at all. It appears in the very last panel of the story as a caption, a piece of narration written by Stan Lee, floating over the image of Peter walking away alone, the closing thought of the whole tale. It is the narrator, the storyteller, telling us the lesson, not a character speaking it inside the scene. The idea that Uncle Ben said it, that it came out of his mouth as fatherly advice, is a retcon that arrived years later. It got attached to Ben in an audio adaptation in the early 1970s, and then it worked its way into the comics themselves through the 1980s, until eventually everyone agreed that of course Uncle Ben said it. It is the whole point of Uncle Ben. But the original was a caption, a piece of authorial voice, and I find that oddly moving. The line quoted more than any other in the genre started life not as something a character believed, but as the author leaning in over the last panel to make sure you did not miss the point. Ben grew into the words later, the way a memory grows more meaningful the further you get from it. I want to stay with Uncle Ben a moment longer, because he occupies a very unusual position in this whole universe, and it is a restful thing to think about. Marvel Comics is a place where almost nobody stays dead. Heroes die and come back. Villains die and come back. Whole realities get destroyed and rebuilt. Death is a revolving door for nearly everyone, and in the middle of all that, Uncle Ben has stayed dead. For over 60 years, through every reboot and resurrection and cosmic reset, through stories where Peter himself has technically died more than once, the one grave they have never seriously reopened in the main continuity is Ben's. He is the fixed point. He has to be. Because if Ben comes back, the guilt lifts. And if the guilt lifts, Peter is just a strong young man in a mask, and the whole thing collapses. Ben's permanence is the load-bearing wall of the character. Everyone else gets to come back. Ben pays for all of it by staying gone. There is a strange, discarded piece of history hanging off the edge of the family, which I will tell you carefully, because it is one of those things Marvel published and then pretended it never had. In the early 2000s, there was a miniseries, a romance story set in the past, that heavily implied something startling about that household, that a teenage May had secretly given birth to Peter and handed the baby to Richard and Mary Parker to raise, which would have made Aunt May, secretly, Peter's biological mother. It was floated, it was published, and it landed so badly with everyone that Marvel simply stopped acknowledging it. It is not part of the story anymore in any functional sense. But it happened, it exists on paper. An official Marvel comic once suggested that the aunt was the mother, and it is the kind of abandoned road that makes the tidy version of the mythology feel a lot more chaotic and lived in than it looks from the outside. I mention it not because it counts, it does not, but because at this hour I find these buried alternate versions strangely comforting. All these paths the character almost went down and then backed away from. That is really the origin, the whole load-bearing structure of it. A lonely science kid, a dying spider, a selfish choice, a dead uncle, and a lesson delivered by the narrator that the character spent decades growing into. Everything else, every villain and love and loss still to come, hangs off that one guilt. He could have stopped the guy. He didn't. His uncle is dead because of it, and so now he stops everyone forever, because he cannot stop the one that mattered. There is no rush to get anywhere from here. We have the boy, and we have the wound. Let us look at the suit he built to cover it. Let us talk about how he actually works, the mechanics of him, because this is a place where the comics and the films part ways, and the comics version is the one I find more tender. Start with the webbing, because it is the thing everyone thinks they understand. On the screen, in the version most people carry, the webbing comes out of Peter's body. He is bitten, he mutates, and part of the mutation is that he can spin silk from his wrists, the way a real spider spins from its abdomen. That is a clean idea, and it works beautifully in a 2-hour film. It is also not the comics. It was a change Sam Raimi made for the 2002 movie, and only that. In the comics, the webbing is a machine, and that is the whole point of it. Peter, remember, is a science prodigy, a kid whose one gift before the spider was a real, formidable talent for chemistry and engineering. After the bite, he sits down in his aunt's house and he invents a fluid, a web fluid, a chemical he cooks up himself, and then he designs and builds the devices that spray it, small mechanical shooters he wears strapped to his wrists under the gloves. He makes the tools, and the reason this matters, the reason Stan Lee loved it, is that a machine can fail. The cartridges hold a finite amount of fluid and they run dry. The shooters can jam. He can be swinging over a canyon of city street and hear that little click of an empty chamber, and there is genuine, mortal suspense in that. A suspense you simply do not get from a body that never runs out. The web being a gadget is what keeps Peter's brain and Peter's poverty in the story. He has to make more fluid, which costs money he does not have, and he has to maintain the shooters, and when he is broke, he is underarmed. The organic version is more elegant. The mechanical version is more human, and it keeps the science kid in the superhero. The chemistry of the web fluid has actually been worked out in surprising detail over the years, and it is a lovely thing to drift on because it is so specific. The fluid is described as a sheer thinning liquid, meaning it flows when it is forced through the nozzle under pressure, but sets almost instantly when it hits the air, knitting into that familiar web. It is fired at something like 300 pounds per square inch. And there is a detail I adore, which is that the webbing is designed to fall apart on its own. After about an hour, the fluid breaks down, dissolves into a fine powder, and blows away. This is deliberate on Peter's part in the fiction. It means that when he leaves a mugger webbed to a lamppost for the police, the evidence and the restraint both quietly disappear within the hour, so the crook can be freed, and the webbing cannot be scooped up and reverse-engineered by anyone who wants to know how it works. A teenager thought about chain of custody. That is the kind of texture that makes this character feel real to me at this hour. That the webbing has an expiration timer built in for legal and security reasons that Peter worked out himself. Then there is the strength, which is easy to get wrong in either direction. Spider-Man is strong, but he is not in the bracket of the true powerhouses, and that gap is important to who he is. By the old official handbooks that tried to codify all of this, his lifting strength sits at around the class where he can hoist something in the neighborhood of 10 tons, and he can push past that under real duress, when someone he loves is about to die, in the way that any of these characters can dig deeper when the stakes demand it. But he is not moving mountains. He is not trading punches on equal footing with the strongest beings in the universe. His edge is not raw power. It is the combination. The strength, plus the speed, plus the agility, plus the wall crawling, plus that warning sense, all wrapped around a fighter who is truly clever and almost impossible to pin down. He wins by being faster and smarter and more slippery than people who could crush him if they ever managed to hold still long enough to grab him. There is something I find restful in that. A hero whose gift is not that he is the mightiest, but that he is very hard to catch, and he refuses to stay down. The wall crawling itself is one of those powers that is so familiar, we forget how strange it is. He clings to sheer surfaces, glass, brick, steel, hanging upside down from a ceiling as easily as standing on a floor. And in the fiction, this is a fine electrostatic and molecular grip, an attraction between his body and the surface that he can switch on and off, right down to controlling it so precisely that he does not accidentally stick to everything he touches. That control is why Ditko left the boots off the design. Bare feet or thin coverings grip better. Every part of the look came out of the logic of the power. And then the sense, the famous spider sense, which is the power people misunderstand the most. And I want to be precise about it, because it is not the mind-reading, all-knowing radar it sometimes gets treated as. The spider sense is a warning. It is a prickle, a buzz at the base of the skull that alerts him to danger a fraction of a second before it arrives, and it scales, so a small threat gives a small tingle, and a huge one screams. But it does not tell him what the danger is. It does not read minds, or reveal a plan, or identify an attacker. It just says, danger, now, that way. And it has real canonical limits, which is the part I love, because a power with holes in it is a power that can generate stories. His spider sense famously does not warn him against his own clones, because they share his exact biology and read to the sense as himself, as no threat at all. And it does not warn him against the alien symbiote that would become Venom, because that creature spent time bonded to Peter's own body, learned the frequency of his danger sense from the inside, and so can move on him completely unannounced. The one enemy who can walk up behind Spider-Man in total silence is the one who used to be his suit. The spider sense is not a cheat code. It is a smoke alarm with specific blind spots, and the blind spots are where the fear lives. The costume that carries all of this went through its own quiet evolution, and the man most responsible for the version burned into the world's memory is not Ditko, it is his successor, John Romita Sr. When Ditko left after that 38th issue, Romita came in, and Romita was a romance comics artist by training, a man who drew beautiful people, and he gently cleaned the whole design up. He dropped the little web wings that Ditko had drawn under the arms, the membranes that stretched from wrist to waist, which most people have forgotten Spider-Man ever had. He made the eye lenses on the mask bigger and more expressive. He tidied the web pattern into something more regular and graceful. And he did all of this while Stan Lee spent something like 6 months complaining that Romita was making Peter Parker too handsome, that the poor unlucky kid should not look like a leading man. Romita kept softening him anyway, until Lee finally gave up and, by the retelling, more or less threw up his hands and told him to just do it his own way. The Spider-Man most people picture, the elegant one, the one on the lunchboxes, is the product of an artist gently overruling his boss about how good-looking the hero was allowed to be. There is a beautiful piece of drawing board history in the webbing itself, in how it looks on the page, from a later era. When Todd McFarlane took over the art in the late 1980s, he started drawing the webbing in this dense, drooping, wildly detailed way, long, tangled strands with real weight and sag to them, meant to add a three-dimensional depth to the pages, a style some fans traced to other art he admired at the time. And the editor-in-chief at the time, Tom DeFalco, hated it, mockingly called it spaghetti webbing, and told McFarlane to knock it off. McFarlane, by the story, agreed to tone it down, and then drew the webs in the very next issue even longer and more tangled than before. That small act of defiance is part of why McFarlane's Spider-Man looked like nothing before it, and why his solo Spider-Man title, when they finally gave him one, sold in numbers the industry had never seen. The look everyone was mocking became the look everyone copied. The sound the webbing makes even took years to settle, which is the kind of tiny thing that only rewards a lifelong fan. In that first Amazing Fantasy story, the web sound effect was rendered one way. In the first issue of the ongoing series, it was rendered another way entirely. It bounced around for a while before the letterers landed, during the Romita years, on the word we all hear now, that clipped little thwip, and it stuck so hard that it is basically onomatopoeia for the whole character. But there was a stretch at the beginning where nobody had decided what the sound of shooting a web actually was, and they tried a few before it became permanent. I think about that sometimes, that even the noise was improvised for a while. And I cannot leave the costume without the black one, though we will come back to where it truly came from later, because its design has one of my favorite behind-the-scenes stories in all of it. When Marvel built the sleek black suit with the white spider on the chest, the artist finishing the design, Mike Zeck, made a specific choice that we now take for granted. He made the accent white. The big spider emblem on the chest, the pads on the hands, white on black. He has said he always drew it in black and white, never black and red, and that clean two-tone starkness is a huge part of why the black suit reads as menacing rather than just dark. But the seed of that whole costume, the very idea of it, did not come from a Marvel artist at all. And that story is so good I am going to make you wait for it, because it belongs with the villain it created. So that is the machine of him, a finite web fired from wrists he built himself, a strength that is formidable but not supreme, a grip he can switch on and off, and a warning sense riddled with specific holes. It is a very particular set of gifts, and none of them are limitless, and that is the whole design. He is powerful enough to matter, and vulnerable enough to lose, permanently balanced on the edge between the two. It is late, and there is no need to hold any of these numbers in your head. Just the shape of it. A young man who is strong and quick and clever and tired, held together with chemistry he cooked up in his aunt's kitchen. Let us go and meet the people whose kitchen it was. A hero is only as good as the room he comes home to, and Spider-Man has one of the richest supporting casts in comics. The whole reason he works, the reason Goodman's fear about personal problems was so wrong, is that Peter Parker's ordinary life is not a break from the story, it is the story. The mask is the vacation. The real drama is the aunt and the rent and the job and the girls. So let us walk through that house and that world slowly, because it is the gentlest part of him. At the center is Aunt May. After Ben dies, she is all the family Peter has. A frail, elderly, endlessly worried woman who does not know her nephew is Spider-Man and spends years fretting that he does not eat enough and stays out too late and works too hard. For decades, the running ache of the series is that Peter cannot tell her the truth, that the thing she worries about is so much larger than she imagines, and that a single shock about it could stop her weak heart. She is the person he is protecting, and the person he can never explain himself to, and that gap is the source of 1,000 small, quiet heartbreaks. May has been written as fragile for most of the character's life, but there is a strength under it that the better writers keep finding. A woman who buried a husband and raised someone else's child and keeps setting the table anyway. May has one story attached to her that I have been saving, and it is one of the strangest things in the whole canon, one of those facts that sounds invented until you check it. Aunt May was once, in 1974, minutes away from marrying Dr. Octopus. It really happened on the page. Otto Octavius, the multi-armed scientist who is one of Peter's deadliest enemies, courted the elderly, gentle Aunt May, and she, knowing nothing of his double life, was charmed by this polite, brilliant gentleman. The reason underneath it was a scheme, of course. May had inherited a remote island, and the island happened to sit on top of, or was the site of, a nuclear reactor, and Otto wanted control of it. So he wooed a widow to get at an atomic facility. And the story builds to an actual wedding ceremony, with Spider-Man watching through a window in pure horror as his nemesis prepares to become his uncle by marriage, before the whole thing is finally broken up when another villain crashes it. Aunt May, the sweetest and gentlest figure in the entire mythology, came within a few spoken words of marrying one of the deadliest men her nephew has ever fought and never knew what she had escaped. I love that one. It is so absurd and so sad and so perfectly Spider-Man that even the aunt cannot get a quiet life. Then there is the job and the newspaper, which is where Peter spends nearly as much time as he does on rooftops. Peter, being broke, needs money, and he hits on a scheme that is deliciously wrong when you think about it. He photographs himself. He rigs a camera, swings around fighting crime as Spider-Man, and sells the pictures of Spider-Man to the newspaper, so that he is the only photographer in the city who can always get the shot. And the paper he sells them to is the Daily Bugle, run by the great blustering thundercloud of a man, J. Jonah Jameson. Jameson is one of the best supporting characters in comics, and he is best understood as an engine of pure, sustained, comic frustration. He is the publisher of the Bugle, a cigar-chewing, flat-topped, penny-pinching newspaperman who has decided, as a matter of editorial policy and personal obsession, that Spider-Man is a menace, a masked vigilante who cannot be trusted, and he runs headline after headline saying so. And the exquisite joke that runs for decades, is that the man supplying Jameson with his best Spider-Man photographs is Spider-Man himself. Peter takes Jameson's money to print pictures Peter took of himself, under headlines calling Peter a threat to the city. The person slandering him is signing his paychecks. The thing almost nobody knows about Jameson is that he is Stan Lee. Lee said as much, more than once, that Jameson was essentially a caricature of himself, a much grumpier, louder, more bullheaded version of Stan Lee. And other writers who worked closely with Lee agreed that Jonah was as close as Lee ever came to putting himself on the page. There is something wonderful in that the loudest, most self-important, most gloriously wrong character in the book was the author's own exaggerated self-portrait. And it goes one step further, because Lee later admitted that when the films came around, he was jealous, that he would have loved to play Jameson himself and felt he was too old for it, and he told the actor who did play him that he envied him the role. The man wrote himself into the comic as a windbag and then wished he could have played the windbag on screen. Jameson is not the only soul in that newsroom, and the Bugle has one figure who matters as its conscience, Robbie Robertson, the editor who serves as Jameson's steady moral counterweight, the calm, decent man who reins Jonah in and treats Peter fairly. When Robertson first appeared in the 1960s, he was one of the earliest prominent black supporting characters at Marvel, given real dignity and a real inner life, at a time when that was rare in the medium, a quiet piece of progress folded into the everyday furniture of the strip. And there is Betty Brant, Jameson's secretary, who became Peter's first serious girlfriend, a sweet, anxious young woman whose romance with Peter kept getting crushed under the weight of his secret life, before she eventually drifted away and, later, married another reporter. Betty carries one of those charming behind-the-scenes wrinkles too. Readers wrote in early on, puzzled that teenage Peter was dating a working secretary who seemed older than him, and rather than fix it in the story, the editors simply explained in the letters column that Betty had dropped out of school and was actually closer to Peter's age than she looked. A continuity problem solved not by a comic, but by an editor answering the mail. Around Peter's own age sits the high school world, and the figure who looms there is Flash Thompson. Flash is the jock, the bully, the big handsome athlete who torments skinny Peter Parker in the hallways and calls him names. And note the delicious irony that Lee built in from the start. Flash Thompson is Spider-Man's single biggest fan. He idolizes Spider-Man, defends him, runs a fan club for him, all while shoving the actual Spider-Man into lockers because he has no idea they are the same person. Flash worships the mask and torments the boy inside it, and that is a small, perfect engine of dramatic irony that the writers have run for decades. And Flash has about the least predictable long arc of anyone in the cast. He grew up, he went into the military, he served in war, and he came home having lost both of his legs. And years later, in a genuinely moving turn, that wounded veteran, that former bully who spent his whole life wishing he could be Spider-Man, bonds with the Venom symbiote and becomes a hero in his own right, Agent Venom, using the alien suit's power to walk and to fight and finally, in a way, to be the thing he had idolized since he was a teenager. The bully became, the fan became the hero. It took about 50 years of real time to pay off, and it is one of the great slow payoffs in the whole mythology. The love interests are their own constellation, and 2 stars in it burn brighter than the rest. The first is Gwen Stacy, who Peter met on his first day at college, at the fictional Empire State University, a smart, poised, blonde young woman who becomes his great early love. We are going to spend real time with Gwen later, because what happens to her changed comics forever. So for now, I will just let her stand here at the beginning, the golden first love, the girl from the science lab, before any of the sadness. And the second is Mary Jane Watson, who arrived in one of the great slow-build entrances in the medium. For over a year, Mary Jane was talked about but never seen. Aunt May and a neighbor kept trying to set Peter up with this Watson girl from down the street, and Peter kept dodging it, and when she did start to appear on the page, the artists coyly hid her face, behind a plant, turned away, obscured, for issue after issue, running the joke that this blind date Peter was dreading was surely going to be a disaster. And then, finally, she is revealed, in full, standing in the doorway, and she is dazzling, and she delivers the line that became one of comics' legendary first appearances, telling Peter, in effect, that he has just hit the jackpot. The girl he spent a year dreading turned out to be the brightest presence in the room. That reveal, that face, was designed by John Romita Sr., and it landed so hard that Mary Jane went from a running gag to, eventually, the love of Peter's life. The college those two loves orbit, Empire State University, is itself a nice little piece of invented New York, and there is a charming geographical confusion baked into it. Empire State is a made-up school, but the artist modeled its look on real campuses, drawing its buildings after Columbia University uptown, while placing the school itself down near New York University in Greenwich Village. So it is a kind of composite dream campus, Columbia's stone architecture sitting in NYU's neighborhood, a school that exists only in the geography of the comics. One story is even said to have borrowed the name of a real NYU dormitory for one of its buildings, though that detail has always felt more like fan folklore than confirmed fact. It is the same trick the whole strip pulls with the city, a New York that is precisely real enough to feel true, and just fictional enough to hold a man who swings between the buildings. And that trick, the almost real city, produced my favorite piece of geography in the entire canon, a thing that spilled out of the fiction and into an actual street. For years, Peter and May's house had no fixed address, but eventually the comics settled it, placing the Parker home at a specific street number in Forest Hills Gardens, in Queens, a real and lovely neighborhood. And here is the part that gets me. There is a real house at roughly that address, and by a pure coincidence, the real-life family who lived there was actually named Parker. A real Parker family, at Spider-Man's canonical Queens address, who for years received fan mail sent to Peter Parker, letters from children writing to Spider-Man, arriving in the mailbox of an ordinary family who just happened to share the name. The fiction reached out and touched a real front door in Queens, and the people behind it had to keep gently explaining that no, their boy was not the one who swings between the towers. There is something so warm about that to me. At this hour, the idea of the myth leaking out of the page and landing, softly, on the doorstep of a real family who simply had the right name. That is the world he comes home to. A worried aunt, a newspaper that pays him to insult himself, a bully who idolizes him, a decent editor, a first love and a great love, a dream of a college stitched together out of two real ones, and a house on a real street where real Parkers once got his mail. It is a densely populated, deeply ordinary life, and the ordinariness is the point. He saves the city and then he has to make rent. Rest in that for a moment before we go and meet the people who spent 60 years trying to end him. Now the villains, and I want to take them slowly and one at a time, because Spider-Man has the best rogues gallery in comics, and the reason it is the best is that so many of them are not monsters at all. They are men. They are usually men who made a slightly different choice than Peter did, men who got a version of his gifts and used them for themselves, and taken one by one, they are almost all sad in some specific, human way. The gentlest way to walk through them is more or less in the order they arrived, back in those first Ditko years when the whole gallery was being built at a pace that seems impossible now. The very first supervillain Spider-Man ever fought was the Chameleon, a master of disguise who could impersonate anyone. And the Chameleon carries a secret in his name that most readers have gone their whole lives without noticing. His real name is Dmitry Smerdyakov, and Smerdyakov is a direct lift from Russian literature, from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, where Smerdyakov is the reputed illegitimate son, the servant, the outsider of the family, and the name itself is built on a Russian root that means, roughly, to stink. It is a name that means the one who reeks, the shameful one, the one nobody claims. And that turns out to be perfect, because the Chameleon was later retconned into the half-brother of another villain we will get to, Kraven the Hunter, the neglected, illegitimate, unloved sibling standing in the shadow of a golden aristocratic brother. A man with no face of his own, named after literature's celebrated unwanted son. Whoever slipped that reference in was thinking harder than the format required. Then came the Vulture, Adrian Toombs, an aging inventor who builds himself an electromagnetic harness that lets him fly, and who is one of the first great expressions of a theme this gallery returns to again and again, the bitterness of an old man who feels the world took what was his. The Vulture is not young and beautiful. He is bald and gaunt and furious, an elderly engineer who decided the answer to being overlooked was to soar over the city and take what he wanted. And there is something deeply unsettling about his glee, an old man who found, in crime, a second youth. And then, in only the third issue, one of the two greatest enemies Peter will ever have, Dr. Octopus. Otto Octavius is a brilliant, arrogant nuclear scientist who works with a set of mechanical arms. 4 articulated metal limbs he controls to handle dangerous materials from a safe distance. An accident fuses those arms to his body and, in the classic telling, damages his mind, and he emerges as Dr. Octopus, a man with 6 limbs and a genius intellect, and no restraint at all. Stan Lee said the design was simple enough. He just thought a villain with a couple of extra arms would be fun, an octopus of a man. And there is a small, odd piece of fan trivia that floats around unconfirmed. A rumor that Doc Ock's look was inspired by a real-life singer, though nobody has ever nailed it down, and Lee always maintained he just dreamed the character up, though he admitted he liked how the nickname Doc Ock had a warm, almost tender sound to it, which is a strange thing to say about a man who tried to marry your hero's aunt. What makes Octavius the definitive enemy, more than the arms, is what he represents. He is the man Peter might have become. Same field, same brilliance, same scientific gift, and the only real difference is that one of them learned responsibility over a dead uncle, and the other never learned it at all. Octavius is Peter without the guilt, genius with the conscience removed, and that is why their rivalry runs so much deeper than the others. Next came Sandman, a career criminal named William Baker who goes by the alias Flint Marko, and who, after an accident on a beach near an atomic test, finds his body turned to shifting sand, able to become a wall, a wave, a giant fist, a fine cloud that no punch can touch. There is a lovely bit of characterization buried in the alias he chose. Some fans like to read meaning into the alias he chose, imagining the first name Flint as a nod to some long-lost childhood kindness, and the surname Marko as a private vow never again to be anyone's mark, anyone's sucker, anyone's victim, though the comics themselves never actually spell out where the name came from. A criminal whose chosen name, at least by one popular fan reading, gestures half at a good teacher and half at a promise never to be fooled again. Sandman is one of the ones who has drifted back and forth over the years between villain and something softer, a man who never quite decided what he wanted to be, which feels right for someone made of sand. The Lizard is Curt Connors, and he is the tragic one, the enemy Peter least wants to fight because Connors is his friend. Connors is a brilliant surgeon who lost an arm, and who, studying the way reptiles can regrow lost limbs, develops a serum from reptile DNA and tests it on himself, hoping to grow his arm back. It works, and then it does not stop, and it turns him into a savage, man-sized, cold-blooded lizard that wants to wipe out all warm-blooded life. There is a piece of real-world science that quietly undercuts the whole premise, which I find delightful rather than damning. The regeneration Connors was chasing does not actually belong to lizards. The champions of limb regrowth in the real animal world are salamanders and axolotls, amphibians, not reptiles. Real lizards can only regrow a tail, and even then only a floppy, cartilage version, not a true limb. So by the actual biology, Curt Connors' reptile serum should not have grown him a perfect new arm at all. If it did anything, it might have grown him a spare tail. The most famous reptile science villain in comics is built on a mix-up between lizards and salamanders, and honestly, at this hour, I find that more charming than any correct version would have been. Electro is Max Dillon, a lineman who is struck by lightning in a freak accident and becomes a living capacitor, a man who generates and hurls electricity, and who is, at heart, another one of the gallery's small men, a resentful, ordinary guy who suddenly had power crackling off his skin and used it, predictably, for robbery. And Mysterio is one of my personal favorites, because Mysterio is a con artist to his bones. Quentin Beck was a Hollywood special effects man and stunt performer, a real talent, one who decided his skills were wasted on the movies and would be better spent on crime. He has no real powers at all. Everything Mysterio does is illusion, smoke, projected images, robotics, hallucinogenic gas, practical effects staged in the real world to make Spider-Man doubt his own eyes. That famous fishbowl helmet, the domed glass globe over his head, was meant to read as a mystic's crystal ball, part of his whole fake sorcerer act, and it doubles as a gas mask to protect him from his own hallucinogens, and a screen to hide the very ordinary special effects man sweating inside it. Even Jonah Jameson, in the comics, looks at him and calls it a fishbowl. I love Mysterio because he is the villain who is essentially a bitter film industry technician, a man whose superpower is that he is very good at his job and very angry about not being famous for it. The Green Goblin arrived in these years too, and he becomes the other great enemy, the equal and opposite of Doc Ock. But his story is so tangled and so central that I am going to hold most of him back for the great tragedies later, because the Goblin is where the real heartbreak lives. For now, one lovely piece of trivia. In his earliest appearances, the Green Goblin did not have the sleek, bat-shaped glider we all picture. By some fan accounts, he first flew on something closer to a plain flying stick, a much sillier and more witchy image than the menacing glider he later got. The design settled into the familiar glider within a handful of issues, and the comics have more or less moved past the earlier look. But by most accounts, it is there in the early pages. One of the scariest villains in comics, looking a little less intimidating before the design was refined. And then Kraven the Hunter, Sergei Kravinoff, who might be the plainest literary lift in the whole gallery. Kraven is a big game hunter, a Russian aristocrat who has hunted and killed every dangerous animal on Earth and grown bored of it, and who decides that the only worthy prey left is a man, and specifically Spider-Man, the hardest game he can imagine. He wears a leopard skin vest and a lion's mane, and he refuses to use guns, hunting with his bare hands and his wits and potions that give him strength. And Kraven is, quite openly, a lift from a specific and famous short story. He is General Zaroff from The Most Dangerous Game, Richard Connell's tale from 1924 about a Russian aristocrat who, having grown bored of hunting animals, begins hunting shipwrecked men on his private island for sport. Kraven is Zaroff transplanted into the Marvel Universe almost whole. The same Russian nobility, the same weariness with animal prey, the same conviction that hunting a thinking human is the only hunt left worth the effort, even the same detail of a man who fled his homeland after the revolution swept away his class. Two of Spider-Man's most memorable enemies, the Chameleon and Kraven, revealed to be half-brothers, are both sitting on top of famous works of literature, one out of Dostoevsky and one out of a classic adventure story, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And Kraven, we will find, gets the single greatest story any of these villains was ever given, but that too is for later. They kept coming through those years, faster than seems believable. Scorpion, a private eye deliberately mutated into a giant armored scorpion who, by cruel design, was made stronger than Spider-Man specifically to beat him, and who promptly went insane from the process. And eventually the writers did the obvious, wonderful thing and put a group of them together. In an early annual, 6 of these enemies teamed up for the first time as the Sinister Six, led by Dr. Octopus, with the Vulture, Electro, Kraven, Mysterio, and Sandman rounding out the roster, 6 of Spider-Man's deadliest foes deciding that if none of them could beat him alone, perhaps all of them together could. The Sinister Six became an idea that has endured across the whole mythology, a rotating supergroup of villainy that has been reassembled in dozens of forms since. But the original 6 are the classic lineup, and they were all built in those first couple of years, one after another, at a pace that no one has really matched since. What strikes me about all of them, lying here in the quiet, is how few of them are evil in any grand cosmic sense. They are a bored aristocrat, a bitter old inventor, a failed effects man, a lonely electrician, a career crook made of sand, a surgeon who loved his family too much to accept losing an arm. They are people. They are almost all people who got a fragment of what Peter got and lacked the one thing he had: the dead uncle, the guilt, the responsibility. That is why the gallery is so good. It is not a parade of monsters. It is a gallery of men who took the other road, and every time Peter fights one of them, he is, in a small way, fighting a version of the person he might have been. There is no hurry to remember all their names, just that feeling that his worst enemies are mostly just people who never had an Uncle Ben. Let us keep going into the ones who came a little later and a little darker. As the years went on, the gallery kept filling in, and the newer arrivals brought a different weather with them. A little more crime drama, a little more horror, a little more moral rot. The Romita era and after gave Spider-Man some of his heaviest enemies, and their behind-the-scenes stories are, if anything, even stranger than the villains themselves. Rhino came first among the later heavies, a simple, almost sweet-natured brute, a low-level thug named Alexei who was sealed into an unbreakable armored suit shaped like a rhinoceros and given the strength to match, and who mostly just wants to charge in a straight line at whatever is in front of him. Rhino is one of the ones the writers have grown genuinely fond of over the decades. A big, dim man in a suit he can never take off, and some of his best stories are the ones where he just wants to be left alone to have a quiet life and the world will not let him. Shocker followed, Herman Schultz, a smart safecracker who built himself a pair of gauntlets that fire concussive blasts of vibrating air, and who is, endearingly, about as professional and unambitious a villain as the whole book has. A working criminal who is good at his job, knows his limits, and mostly just wants to rob things and not get hit. Fans love Shocker precisely because he is so unglamorous, a competent middle management supervillain in a quilted yellow suit. And then Kingpin, Wilson Fisk, who is a different order of threat entirely, because Kingpin has no powers at all and is arguably more dangerous than anyone with them. Fisk is the boss of organized crime in New York, an enormous man in an immaculate white suit, and the key to understanding him, visually, is that his bulk is not fat, it is drawn as muscle, a mountain of muscle under the tailoring, so that this refined, softly spoken crime lord can pick a man up and break him with his bare hands when the negotiation is over. His look was modeled on a specific actor, Sidney Greenstreet, the heavy-set character actor from The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, that same combination of enormous physical presence and silky, cultured menace. Kingpin is the villain who reminds you that you do not need a lightning accident to be a monster. You just need to decide that the city belongs to you and be willing to do anything to keep it. And he has been Spider-Man's enemy, and Daredevil's enemy, and everyone's enemy, because organized crime touches everything. Morbius arrived in 1971, and he matters for reasons beyond himself, because of what his existence signals about the industry. Morbius is a tragic living vampire, a Nobel-caliber biochemist named Michael Morbius who, dying of a rare blood disease, tries to cure himself with an experimental treatment involving vampire bats, and instead turns himself into a pale, fanged, blood-craving creature, a vampire made by science rather than by a curse. And there is a popular story about Morbius that I want to correct, because it is one of those bits of received wisdom that is repeated everywhere and is actually wrong. The tale goes that Morbius was cleverly written as a science vampire specifically to sneak past the comics code, which for years had flatly banned vampires from comics, and that by making him a medical accident rather than a supernatural being, the writers dodged the ban. It is a good story. It is also debunked. By the time Morbius appeared, the code had already been revised to permit classic-style vampires again, so Morbius was written as a science-based vampire because the creators wanted to, not because they were smuggling him past a rule that no longer applied. The reason the code had loosened, though, is a genuinely important story, and it belongs with Spider-Man specifically, so hold that thread, because we will pull it hard in a little while. The Punisher deserves a slow moment, because his origin as a piece of writing is so much smaller than what he became. Frank Castle, the Punisher, is now a household name at Marvel, a grim ex-soldier who wages a one-man war on crime with guns instead of webs, a whole franchise of his own, and he was created to be disposable. The writer Jerry Conway built him as a one-off, a hired gun, a guest antagonist meant to show up, cause some trouble in a single Spider-Man story, and be gone. Conway supplied the core concept, a killer with a personal moral code, an assassin who only kills those he judges to deserve it. And the name, the Punisher, that famous name, was Stan Lee's. Lee came up with it. So one of the best-known figures in the whole line started as a throwaway henchman with a name his boss dreamed up on the way past. Even the skull, that enormous white skull emblem across the chest that has become one of the logos everyone recognizes in pop culture, grew on the drawing board. Conway's original sketch had only a small skull design. It was John Romita Sr. who blew it up into that huge, unmissable death's head across the whole torso, and who added the clever, gruesome touch that the long teeth of the skull extend down to form the character's belt, so the emblem and the gear are one shape. The disposable henchman with the boss's name and the artist's skull outlived nearly everyone who was supposed to matter more. The Hobgoblin is the villain I have to tell you about, mostly because of the spectacular behind-the-scenes disaster around his identity, which is one of the great cautionary tales in comics writing. The Hobgoblin was introduced in the early 1980s as a new mystery villain, someone who had found the original Green Goblin's hideouts and equipment and taken up the identity, and the whole hook was, who is he really? Whose face is under the mask? The writer who created him, Roger Stern, had a specific person in mind, a wealthy, cold, fashion magnate character named Roderick Kingsley, and Stern was building slowly toward that reveal. And then Stern left the book before he could get there. The writers who followed him did not necessarily know or agree with his plan, and after a lot of back and forth, they eventually unmasked the Hobgoblin as a completely different character, the reporter Ned Leeds, and they did it right after killing Ned Leeds off in another story, so the reveal was of a dead man. It satisfied almost nobody. And so, more than a decade later, Roger Stern came back and wrote a whole new story, specifically to fix it, to retcon the retcon, revealing that the real Hobgoblin had been Roderick Kingsley all along, exactly as he had originally intended, and that Kingsley had brainwashed poor Ned Leeds and set him up as a decoy, a fall guy, to take the heat and, ultimately, the death. It took years and multiple writers and a returning creator undoing his successor's work to get a single villain's identity back to what the man who invented him had meant all along. It is the clearest example I know of what happens in serialized comics when a plan outlives the person holding it. And then Carnage, who closes out this stretch as the darkest thing in the gallery, and whose creation is a perfect little story about a character escaping his maker's intentions. To understand Carnage, you have to understand what happened with Venom first, and we will do Venom's full origin properly later. But the short version is that Venom, the black alien symbiote bonded to a man named Eddie Brock, was meant to be a limited, terrifying figure. His creator, David Michelini, intended to kill Eddie Brock off fairly quickly and let the symbiote hop from host to host as a recurring nightmare, never settling, never becoming familiar. But Venom became wildly, unexpectedly popular. Readers loved him, wanted more of him, wanted him as an anti-hero, someone who would fight worse monsters, and that popularity made it impossible to kill him or keep him purely villainous. So Michelini did the next thing. If Venom had to soften into an anti-hero, he would create a new symbiote character who could never be redeemed, a pure, irredeemable monster to fill the space Venom was leaving. That character was Carnage, the offspring of the Venom symbiote bonded to a genuine serial killer named Cletus Cassidy, a man who was a remorseless murderer before he ever got any powers. And the artist Eric Larson, who helped design him, modeled Carnage's chaotic, giggling, kill-for-the-joy-of-it personality on the Joker. Carnage exists because a villain got too likable, and so his creator built a second one specifically to be impossible to love. It happens almost mechanically in long-running comics. A character drifts towards sympathy, so the machine generates a new one to carry the darkness the old one can no longer hold. That is the fuller gallery, the later and heavier half of it. A dim brute in a rhino suit, a competent professional in quilted yellow, a crime lord built like a mountain and drawn after an old film actor, a science vampire wrapped in a myth that is not even true, a throwaway gunman his boss named who outgrew everyone, a mystery villain whose identity took a decade of infighting to settle, and a giggling red horror created to be everything a fan favorite could not be. I keep coming back to how much of this is accident and afterthought. How many of the icons started as filler or mistakes or corrections of mistakes? It is late, and that might be the gentlest comfort in all of it, that even the monsters were mostly improvised, patched together on deadline, and became permanent almost by surprise. Let us turn now to the stories, the big ones, the ones that made grown readers put the comic down and sit still for a while. There are a handful of Spider-Man stories that people who care about comics talk about the way people talk about certain films or certain records, and I want to spend our longest, slowest stretch here on 4 of them, because these are the ones that changed what the character was allowed to be. We will go gently. None of this is going anywhere. We are just going to sit with the sad, important stories for a while. The first is the one that broke the reader's heart and, a lot of people would say, ended an entire era of comics. It is the death of Gwen Stacy in 1973, and it is impossible to overstate how much it mattered. Gwen, by this point, was Peter's great college love, the golden girl from the science lab, the relationship that felt like it might actually be the one. And in a 2-part story, the Green Goblin, who has figured out that Peter is Spider-Man, takes the most direct and cruel revenge available to him. He kidnaps Gwen, carries her to the top of a bridge over the water, and when Spider-Man arrives, the Goblin throws her off. Peter shoots a web line down after her, and the web catches her leg, and for a heartbeat it looks like a save, like the impossible last-second rescue we have seen him pull off 100 times. And then he pulls her up, and she is dead. What killed her is the thing the story leaves haunting and unresolved, deliberately. When the web line snapped taut and stopped her fall, the sudden jolt, the whiplash of going from a long plunge to a dead stop in an instant, is what appears to have broken her neck. And the reason readers understood this, the detail that turned a rescue into a horror, is a single small sound effect on the art. Near Gwen's head, right at the point where the web catches her, the artist lettered a tiny sound, a snap, and that snap changed everything, because it implied that the fatal injury happened at the moment of the catch, which means that Spider-Man's own webbing, his own attempt to save her, may have been the thing that killed her. He did not fail to catch her. He caught her, and the catching is what broke her. Here is the piece that fans have argued about ever since. That snap was not in the writer's script. Jerry Conway wrote the story, but the sound effect, that devastating little snap, was added by the artist Gil Kane on the page itself. One letterer's choice, one artist's instinct, created the cruelest ambiguity in comics. The possibility that the hero killed the woman he loved by trying to save her. The letter's page a few issues later eventually confirmed that yes, the whiplash of the sudden stop was what killed her. But the comic itself never quite says it out loud in the moment, and that silence is what makes it unbearable. There is a smaller, famous confusion tangled into that same scene, and it is the sort of snag fans have been affectionately arguing about for 50 years. Which bridge was it? In the dialogue, a character names it as one bridge, the George Washington Bridge. But the bridge the artist actually drew, in the interior art and on the cover, looks like a different bridge entirely, the Brooklyn Bridge, with its distinctive stone towers. So the script says one thing, and the picture shows another, and the two have never been fully reconciled. Stan Lee himself later admitted, in effect, that the artist drew one bridge and he, editing the words, labeled it as the other, and it was simply never caught. Later writers and reprints have sometimes tried to correct it one way or the other, but the discrepancy itself has become part of the legend, an argument fans are almost fond of, the bridge that is two bridges at once. And the reason Gwen died at all, the editorial machinery behind it, is its own sad, revealing story. The creators wanted to shake up Peter's life, to prove that in this comic anyone really could be lost. And the first plan was not to kill Gwen. The first plan was to kill Aunt May. And it was Conway and the artist John Romita who argued against that. On the grounds that May served a specific function, she kept Peter a kid, a young man with someone frail to look after and answer to, and that without her, Peter would suddenly read as a full adult and lose something essential. So they turned away from May and toward Gwen, in part because the Peter and Gwen romance had, in their view, stalled. Marriage was not on the table in that era, and they felt there was nowhere left to take the relationship, so ending it, permanently and shockingly, seemed like the only forward motion left. The creators have told the story of exactly who suggested what at least 5 different ways over the decades, and I will not pretend to know whose memory is right, because they themselves do not agree. But the shape of it is clear enough. A young woman was killed because the writers felt her story had run out of road, and the choice landed with a force none of them fully predicted. It is widely credited with ending the innocent Silver Age of comics and beginning the darker, more mournful Bronze Age. And it helped originate a narrative pattern that a later critic would name the killing of a hero's girlfriend mainly to give the hero pain, a device the character's own history now sits at the very origin of. Gwen has stayed dead too in the main line. She has never been brought back as Peter's Gwen. The blonde in the alternate universe some of you may be thinking of is a different Gwen entirely, and we will get to her. The second great story is quieter and more real-world, and it is the one where a Spider-Man comic went to war with the censors and won. To understand it, you have to know about the Comics Code, a system of self-censorship the whole industry had adopted in the 1950s after a moral panic about comics corrupting children, a strict list of rules about what could and could not appear, enforced by a little seal of approval on the cover. And one of the code's rules was an absolute ban on any depiction of drugs, any mention at all, even to condemn them. Now here is the part that surprises people. By the early 70s, the United States government, through its Department of Health, actually reached out to Stan Lee and asked him to write an anti-drug story, to use Spider-Man's reach to warn kids about addiction. So Lee wrote one, a 3-issue story in which Peter's friend and roommate Harry Osborn, the Green Goblin's son, falls into pill addiction, spiraling, frightening, clearly meant as a warning. And Lee submitted it to the Comics Code, and the code refused to approve it because the rules banned any drug content whatsoever, even a story whose entire message was that drugs will destroy you. The government asked for it and the censors said no. So Marvel, backed by its publisher, made a decision that took real nerve at the time. They printed the 3 issues anyway, without the Comics Code seal on the cover, the first major comics in years to go out naked, unapproved, defiant. And nothing bad happened. The issues sold well, the message was praised, and the sheer obvious absurdity of the situation, a company being blocked from publishing a government-requested anti-drug story, embarrassed the code so thoroughly that within the year it revised its rules. That same revision is the one that loosened the horror restrictions and let vampires back into comics, which, remember, is the real reason Morbius could exist a few months later. A single Spider-Man story, requested by the government and rejected by the censors and published in defiance anyway, cracked the power of the institution that had controlled American comics for a generation. There is a nice bitter footnote too, which is that the rejection may have come down to bad luck as much as principle, that the regular code administrator was reportedly out sick, and the refusal was handed down by a stand-in from a rival, more conservative publisher. A generation of censorship blinked, partly because the wrong man was at the desk that week. The third story is the one many fans, if you made them pick, would call the single best Spider-Man story ever told, and it is called Kraven's Last Hunt from 1987. Remember Kraven, the aristocratic hunter built out of an old adventure story, the man who wanted to hunt Spider-Man as the ultimate prey. This is his ending, and it is nothing like a normal superhero fight. Kraven, old now and consumed by a lifetime of feeling that he has never truly won, decides on a final hunt. He shoots Spider-Man, and he buries him, alive or dead he is not even sure, in a grave, and then he does the thing that makes the story unforgettable. He puts on a copy of Spider-Man's costume and goes out into the city and is Spider-Man, for a while, more brutal and more effective than Peter ever was, to prove to himself that he is not just the hunter's equal, but his superior, that he can be a better Spider-Man than the real one. And when Peter finally claws his way up out of the grave and confronts him, Kraven does not fight to the death. He has proven what he needed to prove, and having finally, in his own mind, won, having caught and bettered his great prey, he sees no reason to go on. He lets Peter live, sets his affairs in order, and takes his own life. It is a story about obsession and depression, and the emptiness that can wait on the far side of finally getting the thing you spent your whole life chasing, and it is astonishing that it was ever a Spider-Man comic at all. And it very nearly was not, which is the behind-the-scenes turn I love. The writer, J.M. DeMatteis, did not originally conceive of this as a Spider-Man story at all. By some accounts, the core idea, a brother who buries his brother alive and takes his place to prove he is the better man, had first been floated for a completely different character, said to be Wonder Man. As the story reportedly goes, when that idea went nowhere, DeMatteis reworked the same essential plot as a Batman and Joker story and pitched it to the other publisher, where it was said to have been passed on as well. Only after 2 rejections, reshaped a second time, did the buried alive take his place idea finally land on Spider-Man and Kraven, where it fit better than it ever would have anywhere else, because Kraven the aristocratic hunter, unlike Wonder Man or the Joker, had a whole psychology of obsession and superiority already built into him, waiting. The greatest Spider-Man story of all is a plot that got rejected twice for other characters first. And even its haunting title came from elsewhere. The phrase "fearful symmetry" that the original chapters ran under was pulled by an editor straight out of a William Blake poem, the one about the tiger burning bright, which is the perfect poem for a story about a hunter and his terrible, beautiful prey. The 4th story is really the origin of a costume that became a character, that became a franchise, and it holds the single best piece of trivia in all of Spider-Man, so I want to build to it properly. In the mid-1980s, in a big company-wide crossover event, Spider-Man's red and blue costume gets damaged, and he acquires a new one, a sleek black costume with a white spider on the chest. That seems to be a marvel of technology, able to change shape, to form webbing on its own, to respond to his thoughts. He wears it for a good while, and it is only later that the horror sets in, that the black costume is not a costume at all. It is alive. It is an alien, a symbiote, a living organism that bonds to a host and feeds on them and does not want to let go, and it has been slowly, secretly trying to make itself a permanent part of Peter, bonding to him in his sleep, taking him out at night without his knowledge. Peter, horrified, manages to reject it and tear it off, and the rejected, wounded symbiote goes looking for a new host, full of hatred for the man who cast it out. It finds Eddie Brock, a disgraced journalist who also blames Spider-Man for ruining his life, and the two of them together, the rejected alien and the ruined man, both consumed by the same specific hatred of Peter Parker, become Venom. Now, 2 behind-the-scenes turns, and then the great one. First, Venom's human host was very nearly not a man at all. In the original plan, the person the symbiote bonded with was going to be a woman, a grieving mother who had lost her baby, a completely different flavor of tragedy. It was an editor who pushed to change the host to a man, and so the grieving woman became Eddie Brock, the bitter male journalist we know. And second, the look of Venom was shaped by more hands than people think. The artist Todd McFarlane created the hulking body and the huge, jagged grin of teeth. But that trademark long, lolling, dripping tongue, the detail that says Venom faster than anything else, was not McFarlane's. It was added afterward by another artist, Eric Larson. The monster we picture is a committee. And here is the great one, the fact I most wanted to leave you with tonight, because it is so unlikely and so wonderfully small. That whole black costume, the seed of Venom, the seed of Carnage, the seed of an entire corner of Marvel worth untold fortunes, did not come from a Marvel staffer at all. Marvel bought the basic idea The concept of giving Spider-Man a new black costume from a fan. A young man in his early 20s named Randy Schuler sent the company a story pitch, unsolicited, and one element of it was a new black outfit for Spider-Man, and Marvel liked the costume idea enough that they paid him for it. They paid him $220. $220, back in the early 80s, for the design that would grow into Venom and Carnage and everything after them, one of the richest ideas the company has ever owned. In the fans' original version, the suit was reportedly meant to be built by other heroes, said to include Reed Richards and the Wasp, a very different origin than the alien one it eventually got. Schuler's contribution went largely unremembered for decades, and his original story was finally, properly published only years later, as a kind of belated acknowledgement. And the artist who finalized the design from that seed, Mike Zeck, made the choice we talked about earlier, the white spider on black, insisting he always drew it in black and white and never black and red. So the black suit is a fan's $220 pitch, given an alien origin by one team, a woman-then-man host by an editor, a white spider by one artist, and a dripping tongue by another. The most valuable monster in the Spider-Man mythos was assembled, piece by piece, out of a bargain and a series of overrides. 4 stories. A love killed by the hero's own web, with a sound effect the artist added. A comic that broke the censors by publishing a story the government asked for. A hunter's suicide that got rejected twice as other characters first. And a world-shaking monster that started as a fan's cheap pitch. What they have in common, the thing I keep turning over, is how little of what became sacred was planned. The heartbreak, the defiance, the greatness, the franchise, all of it arrived sideways, through accidents and arguments and small human choices made on deadline. It is very late now. Let us stay in this register a little longer and talk about love and marriage and the strangest thing Marvel ever did to undo one. Peter Parker did, once, get to be happy, and the story of that happiness and how it was taken away is the most contentious thing in the character's history, the one that fans still cannot discuss calmly, and I want to walk through it slowly because it is genuinely strange, stranger than most of the supervillain plots. After Gwen died, the relationship that slowly grew to fill the space was Mary Jane Watson, the girl who had once been a running gag hidden behind a plant. Over the years, Peter and Mary Jane grew up together, drifted together, and apart and back, and eventually, in 1987, they married. And Marvel turned the wedding into an event unlike anything the company had done. They staged a real, physical wedding at a baseball stadium in New York, in front of a large crowd, with an actor playing Spider-Man and an actress playing Mary Jane, and with Stan Lee himself presiding over the ceremony in character. They held an actual public wedding to coincide with the issue hitting the stands. A comic book marriage celebrated with a real-world ceremony at a ballpark, officiated by the man who created him. It is one of the great pieces of comics showmanship. And the marriage itself, in the comic, was to a degree an accident of scheduling, which almost nobody realizes. The reason it happened when it happened was that Stan Lee, who by then was writing the Spider-Man newspaper comic strip that ran in ordinary daily papers, had decided to marry Peter and Mary Jane off in the strip. And once the wedding was going to happen in the newspapers, seen by millions of casual readers, the main comics could not very well have Peter still single. So the comic book wedding was essentially rushed into print to match the newspaper strip's timeline. Stories that were in progress got scrapped to clear the way. Peter had actually been in a promising romance with another character, the Black Cat, a reformed cat burglar, and that relationship was hastily ended to get him to the altar with Mary Jane in time. The best-known wedding in Marvel history was, in part, a continuity scramble to keep 2 versions of Spider-Man, the comics one and the newspaper one, from contradicting each other. There is a lovely small piece of Mary Jane's history that fits here, about the moment it was revealed that she had known Peter's secret all along. In a story from the 80s, Mary Jane tells Peter that she knows he is Spider-Man, that she has always known. And it is one of the defining beats she ever got, the idea that this seemingly carefree party girl had been carrying his secret, and the weight of it, silently for years. And it was improvised. The writer Tom DeFalco came up with the line on the spot while scripting the issue, MJ saying she had always known, without a fully worked out backstory for how. It was only later that another writer, Jerry Conway, went back and built the explanation, a story showing that a young Mary Jane, living near the Parkers, had happened to see Spider-Man climbing out of Peter's bedroom window on the very night Uncle Ben died, and had understood, and had said nothing, and had carried it. One of Mary Jane's defining characteristics, that she saw through him before anyone, started as a line a writer reached for in the moment, and other hands made true afterward. Before we get to how the marriage ended, I have to take you through the clones, because the clones are the other great mess of Peter's life, and they are gloriously, notoriously tangled. It starts back in the 1970s. A scientist named Miles Warren, who had been Peter and Gwen's biology professor, went slowly mad with grief and obsession after Gwen's death, blaming Spider-Man, and became a villain called the Jackal. And the Jackal, being a geneticist, made clones. He cloned Gwen, bringing back a copy of the dead woman to torment Peter, and he cloned Peter himself, creating a duplicate Spider-Man, and the two Spider-Men fought, and one of them apparently died, and the story left, very deliberately, a tiny sliver of doubt about which one had walked away, the original or the clone. At the time it read as a strange, sad footnote. The dead clone was dropped down a smokestack, and that seemed to be that. And then, in the mid-1990s, someone had the idea to reopen that door, and it became one of the longest and worst-remembered storylines in comics, the Clone Saga. The clone from the 70s, it turned out, had not died. He had survived, and had spent years wandering the country under the name Ben Reilly, and one detail tells you everything about how much heart is buried under the mess. That the clone chose the name Ben Reilly out of love, Ben after Uncle Ben, and Riley after Aunt May's maiden name. A copy of Peter, alone in the world, named himself after the two people who raised the man he was copied from. Ben Reilly comes back to New York, and for a while he even becomes a hero in his own right, wearing a distinctive costume, a red suit with a blue hooded sweatshirt thrown over it, the Scarlet Spider. And then the story did the thing that enraged an entire readership. It revealed, through genetic testing, that Ben Reilly was the original and Peter Parker was the clone. That the man readers had followed for decades, the real Peter, was the copy, and the drifter was the genuine article. The reason they did that is one of the great cautionary tales of editorial ambition. The plan, originally, was to actually make the switch permanent, to retire Peter Parker, let him and a pregnant Mary Jane walk off into a quiet civilian life to raise their child, and install Ben Reilly, young and unmarried and unburdened, as the new Spider-Man going forward. The whole clone business was meant to be a clean handoff, wrapped up fairly quickly. But the stories sold. They sold so well that the marketing side kept ordering the saga extended, and extended again, stretching a planned handoff into a sprawling 2-year knot of twists and swerves and new clones and fake-outs, until readers had gone from intrigued to exhausted to furious. And the ending, when it finally came, undid all of it. It was revealed that the whole thing had been orchestrated from the shadows by a resurrected enemy, that the genetic tests had been faked, that Peter was the original after all, and poor Ben Reilly, the drifter with the borrowed family name, died saving Peter and crumbled to dust, and the fact that his body decayed at last proved he had been the clone all along. Peter was restored to himself, the switch was undone, and an enormous amount of goodwill had been spent to arrive back roughly where they started. There was even, in the abandoned plans, a far stranger supernatural ending that never saw print, one where cosmic and demonic forces would have been revealed, pulling the strings, folding Peter into a kind of time loop, but that was scrapped for something more grounded and still somehow more convoluted. The enemy who came back to mastermind the end of the Clone Saga was Norman Osborn, the original Green Goblin, who, you will remember, supposedly died back in 1973, impaled on his own goblin glider in the same terrible story that killed Gwen. And bringing him back required inventing a reason, on the spot, that he had survived a wound everyone had watched kill him for over 20 years. So the writers gave the Goblin formula, the chemical that gave Norman his strength, a previously unmentioned side effect, a healing factor that had secretly kept him alive and mended him and let him slip away to Europe to scheme in secret all those years. It is a retcon built purely to serve a plot, and yet Norman Osborn, returned from the dead, has become one of the great recurring villains in the whole line, so much so that it is easy to forget he was resurrected mainly to give the Clone Saga somebody to blame. Which brings us, at last, to the ending of the marriage, and to the single strangest editorial decision in modern Spider-Man. A thing so odd that people who do not read comics often refuse to believe it is real. By the mid-2000s, Peter's life had gotten very complicated. In a big crossover event, under pressure, Peter had publicly unmasked, gone on live television, and told the world that he was Spider-Man, that Peter Parker was the man behind the mask. Which meant everyone he loved was now a target, exposed, and soon enough Aunt May was shot by a sniper aiming at Peter's family and lay dying. And with May dying and his life in ruins from the exposure, Peter is approached, in a story called One More Day, by a demon, by Mephisto, essentially Marvel's devil. And Mephisto makes an offer. He will save Aunt May's life, he will pull her back from death, and he will make the whole world forget that Peter is Spider-Man, restore the secret, undo the exposure and all its damage. And the price for all of it is not a soul. The price is the marriage. Mephisto wants Peter and Mary Jane's marriage, their love, erased, not ended, erased, rewritten so that it never happened at all. And after agonizing, Peter and Mary Jane agree. They let the devil unmake their marriage to save Aunt May. I want to be precise about what this did, because it matters and it is easy to garble. Peter and Mary Jane did not divorce. They did not separate. The marriage was removed from reality, rewritten so that these two people were simply never married. The wedding itself unhappened. The years together folded away. May lived. The world forgot Peter's secret, and the marriage was gone, as though it had never been. The man who steered this, the editor-in-chief at the time, believed a married Peter Parker had aged the character past the point of the relatable young everyman he was meant to be, and that unmarrying him would restore the classic status quo. And it worked in that narrow sense, and it broke a lot of readers' hearts, and the writer who scripted it, Michael Straczynski, disagreed so strongly with where it went that he nearly took his name off the final issues. His original version of the story had reportedly been even bigger, meant to unravel far more than the marriage, and it was scaled back to just this one terrible trade. And here is the thing that still governs the comics today. It has never been reversed. As of right now, in the main continuity, Peter and Mary Jane are not married and, as far as the world is concerned, never were. The wedding itself exists now only in memory and in alternate realities. The devil kept his bargain, and Marvel has kept it too. There is a small, almost sweet piece of resistance to that story worth knowing. The Spider-Man newspaper strip, the same daily strip that had once forced the wedding, was still running when One More Day happened, and it briefly followed suit and erased the marriage there too, and readers of the strip were so upset that within a matter of months, the strip quietly reversed it, explaining the whole interlude away as merely a bad dream Peter had. In the funny pages at least, the marriage survived, undone and then undone because the readers would not have it. The devil was not even the last indignity the character's own body would suffer, because a few years later, Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius, dying, managed one final scheme. Through a piece of technology, he swapped minds with Peter. Otto's mind went into Peter's young, healthy, powerful body, and Peter's mind went into Otto's dying one, and Otto's body gave out, so that as far as the world knew, Peter Parker died, and Dr. Octopus walked away wearing him. And for a long stretch, Otto lived Peter's life, was Spider-Man, called himself the superior Spider-Man, and, being Otto, tried to prove he could be a better Spider-Man than Peter ever was. More efficient, more ruthless, more accomplished, echoing what Kraven had once tried in that grave. Peter's consciousness was not entirely gone, lingering as a suppressed memory ghost inside his own hijacked head, and eventually, he fought his way back to the surface and reclaimed his body. But while Otto was in charge, he did something with lasting consequences. He founded a company, a successful technology company, Parker Industries. And when Peter got his body and his life back, he inherited it, which produces one of the quietly funniest facts in the whole canon, that Peter Parker's own company, the one that briefly made him a wealthy CEO, was founded by his worst enemy, while that enemy was wearing his face. He inherited a corporation from the villain who stole his body. And there is a story, often repeated among fans, that Marvel's editorial leadership had wanted the whole Superior Spider-Man experiment wrapped up quickly, worried that readers would reject a Spider-Man who was secretly Dr. Octopus, and that it was only because the story sold so surprisingly well that the writer got to extend it far past its intended length. The audience, it turned out, was fascinated to watch the villain try to be the hero. I keep circling one thread through all of this, the marriage and the clones and the stolen body, and it is that the people who make Spider-Man have spent an enormous amount of energy, for decades, keeping him from settling, keeping him from being married, from being a father, from being a wealthy adult, from being finished. Every time his life resolves toward peace, some machinery, a clone, a devil, a mind swap, arrives to unresolve it and hand us back the struggling young man in the mask. You can read that as cynical, and sometimes it is. But there is something almost protective in it too, a refusal to let the boy from Queens ever fully arrive, so that he stays, forever, the one who is still trying. It is very late now, and that is a gentle enough thought to carry toward the last stretch, because there is not only one of him anymore. There are, by now, a great many. For most of his life, Spider-Man was the only one boy, one bite, one mask. But somewhere along the way, the idea outgrew the man, and now there is a whole web of them, spider people across other cities and other worlds and other kinds of story, and I want to end our long walk out here, among all the others who wear some version of the suit, because it is a peaceful place to drift. The most important of the others is Miles Morales, a Black and Puerto Rican teenager from Brooklyn who was bitten by his own spider and became his own Spider-Man. Miles did not start in the main Marvel universe. He was created in a separate line, a more modern reimagining of Marvel's world, where that world's Peter Parker had died young, heroically, and left a hole that a grieving city and a watching kid felt keenly, and Miles picked up the name to honor him. Later, when that separate universe collapsed into the main one, Miles migrated over and now lives alongside Peter, not as a replacement, but as his own hero, younger, still figuring it out, carrying the same responsibility down a different street. And Miles exists, in a real sense, because of an actor. A few years before Miles was created, the actor and musician Donald Glover ran a public, good-natured campaign to be considered for the role of Spider-Man in a film, a campaign that caught fire online, and he later wore Spider-Man pajamas in a sight gag on his television show. And one of Marvel's leading writers saw the public appetite for a Spider-Man who did not look like the traditional one, and it directly inspired him to create a Black Spider-Man in the comics. In a lovely closing of the loop, Donald Glover would later voice an animated version of Miles and play Miles's uncle in a Spider-Man film. A joke about casting became a character, became a role the Joker himself got to play. Then there is the Gwen. You may have been waiting for me to explain. Spider-Gwen, sometimes called Ghost Spider, is a version of Gwen Stacy from an alternate universe, a world where the spider bit Gwen instead of Peter, and she became that world's spider hero. And in a bitter mirror of the original tragedy, in her world it was Peter who died. She is not the resurrected girl from the bridge. She is a wholly separate Gwen from a parallel Earth, and it is worth being clear about that, because it would be the easiest thing to assume that Marvel finally brought Gwen back and this is her. They did not. The Gwen who died is still dead. Spider-Gwen is a different woman entirely, from a world that made the opposite choice. And she became so instantly beloved on her debut that she leapt off the page and into films and merchandise almost overnight. One of the great modern success stories in comics. A character created to be a small alternate universe cameo who the audience simply refused to let be minor. The oldest of the wider spiders, in a way, is Spider-Man 2099, Miguel O'Hara, a hero from a cyberpunk future version of the Marvel world, a corporate scientist in a gleaming dystopia who gains spider-like powers and takes up the name from the legends of the past. And what I love about Miguel is that his costume tells you where the character comes from. His suit is built around Day of the Dead imagery, the Mexican tradition, the skull motifs, the death's head design, in honor of Miguel's Latino heritage, and even his flowing cape was conceived to catch the updrafts between the towering skyscrapers of his future city. Miguel arrived in the early 1990s, which means this particular spider hero was already exploring the idea of alternate versions and futures decades before the great multiverse craze that would later sweep through all of superhero fiction. 2099 was doing the parallel worlds thing long before it was fashionable. And there are stranger ones out at the edges. There is a version of Spider-Man who is a cartoon pig, Spider-Ham, an anthropomorphic funny animal parody, where Peter is a spider who bit a pig and turned it into a pig with spider powers, a joke character who has become genuinely beloved. There is a version from Japan, a young woman piloting a giant spider robot. There is Spider-Man India, Pavitar Prabhakar, from a series that rebuilt the entire myth inside Indian tradition, where the boy does not get his powers from a radioactive spider at all, but from an ancient yogi, a holy mystic, and where the Green Goblin figure is not a businessman on a chemical, but a man possessed by a demon out of Hindu mythology, a Rakshasa. Even the name is chosen with care, and fans have long traded theories about what it means in Hindi. It is the whole origin, respun through a different culture's storytelling, and it works because the bones of Spider-Man, a young person given power and burdened with responsibility, are portable. They fit almost any culture you set them down in. All these threads got pulled together into a single enormous story called Spider-Verse, which gathered spider heroes from across every reality to face a common enemy, a family of ancient predators called the Inheritors, led by a being named Morlun, who hunt and devour the life force of spider totems across all the worlds, treating every Spider-Man in every universe as prey. It is built on an idea from that mystical totem retcon we talked about much earlier, the notion of a great web connecting all the spider people across the multiverse, a web of life and destiny, and it turned the character's whole sprawling history of alternate versions into a feature, a family, a war. And it is where a number of these newer heroes, Spider-Gwen chief among them, first stepped onto the stage. The lonely boy from Queens turned out to be the center of a web with countless others hanging from its strands, and the story finally let them all meet. I have to leave you with two of the strangest chapters in Spider-Man's global life, because they are the kind of thing you almost cannot believe until you check, and they are perfect to drift off on. The first is that in 1978, Japan made a live-action Spider-Man television series, and it rewrote nearly everything. In this version, there is no radioactive spider. The hero is given his powers by the blood of a warrior from a distant planet called Planet Spider, and he is granted a bracelet that summons a colossal giant robot named Leopardon, so that a typical episode ends not with a rooftop chase but with Spider-Man piloting a towering mecha in battle against a monster grown to skyscraper size. It sounds like a fever dream, and it was fully licensed, a real deal brokered between the companies, and Stan Lee, rather than being appalled at the giant robot bolted onto his creation, reportedly loved it, embraced it as a wonderful bit of madness rather than disowning it. And the second, my favorite oddity in the whole global history, is that there is a film in which Spider-Man is the villain. In an unauthorized Turkish film from 1973, a low-budget action picture, a green-suited Spider-Man is the antagonist, a sadistic crime boss who terrorizes the city, and the heroes who hunt him down are Captain America and a famous Mexican masked wrestler teaming up to stop him. Spider-Man, the murderer, chased across the film by Captain America and a luchador, and killed at the end. It is arguably one of the very first live-action films to cross superhero characters over at all, and it did it by making one of them a monster. Somewhere out there is a version of this gentle, guilt-ridden boy from Queens, reimagined as a green-clad villain, gunned down by Captain America and a wrestler. And once you know it exists, the whole idea of a single fixed Spider-Man dissolves a little, in the nicest way. There is even something fitting hidden in the name of Peter's own home reality. The main Marvel universe, his universe, has an official designation among fans and writers, a number, Earth 616, and the origin of that number is a small, self-deprecating joke. It came out of Marvel's British office in the early 1980s, and by the account of the people involved, it was chosen as a sly dig, a play on a certain infamous number associated with the beast in scripture, a way of gently mocking the whole superhero genre from the inside, as if to say this over-serious flagship reality is nothing to be so precious about. So the number that fans now use with total reverence to mean the one true Marvel universe began life as an insult aimed at the very thing it names. That is so much of Spider-Man when you look closely. The sacred thing turning out to have a joke at the bottom of it. We did not get to everything tonight, and I want to name a few of the threads I left hanging. Not to make you feel we missed something, but because it is nice to know the web keeps going past the edge of what we walked. We barely touched the films, all the different actors who have worn the mask on screen, and the strange, warm history of Stan Lee turning up for a moment in nearly every one of them, right up to the end of his life, cameo after cameo, until he held records for it. We did not really get into the money, the fact that the first issue is now among the priciest comics ever sold at auction, going for millions, or that a single Spider-Man issue in the early 1990s sold in the millions of copies and helped ignite a whole speculative boom and bust. We skipped past the daily newspaper strip that ran for over 40 years, credited to Stan Lee for his entire life, and even a little after it. And there are whole storylines, a mournful murder mystery on the Daily Bugle's own doorstep, a citywide plague that gave millions of New Yorkers spider powers for a while, quieter years and better ones, that we simply did not have the night for. That is all right. That is another night, or several. The web is bigger than any one walk through it. What I keep coming back to, now that it is very late and we have gone all the way around, is how ordinary the center of it stays. We started with a publisher who was sure nobody would want a hero with problems, and we have spent hours on nothing but the problems. The dead uncle he could have saved, the girl the web could not catch, the marriage a devil unmade, the body his enemy stole, the company he inherited from the man who stole it. For a character defined by extraordinary power, almost every story that matters is about the ordinary thing underneath, the guilt, the grief, the rent, the people he cannot quite keep safe. Goodman thought that was a weakness. It turned out to be the whole reason he lasted. The reason a boy from a canceled comic in 1962 is still here, still swinging, still a little behind on everything. I think that is why I come back to him at this hour, when the day is done and nothing is being asked of me. He is a hero built out of the same stuff ordinary life is built out of: worry and love and small failures and the stubborn decision to get up and try to do the right thing anyway, without ever expecting it to make him happy or rich or finished. He never gets to arrive. And there is something restful in that, in a figure who has made a kind of peace with never arriving, who just keeps going, gently, through the guilt and the city and the years. So that is a good thing to hold on to now, as you drift, the idea that you do not have to arrive anywhere either, not tonight. Nothing is being built toward. There is no payoff waiting. There is just the boy in the mask, out there in the dark over the rooftops, still trying, and there is you, here, warm, allowed to stop. No pressure on anything else, just rest.